Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, Kevin Hassett, and his panelists, David Malpass and Randall Stevenson.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen, and thank to our wonderful hosts for their gracious hospitality. My name is Kevin Hassett. I'm the 29th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. And I thought that I would start the conversation the way that we at the White House started thinking about the problem a long time ago, because the president and Jared came to us at the Council of Economic Advisors. We're basically a large think tank of PhD economists in the White House. And they said, please study the West Bank and Gaza, study their economies, and help us come up with a plan to improve the prosperity, the level of well-being in those countries. And so if you'll tolerate this, as an economist, one of the first things I like to do is define the problem, look at where we are, and think about what our assets and liabilities are. And so before we start the general conversation, I've edited it down to 3 slides, which is really quite an accomplishment for me. But the first thing I want everyone to do is to think about, so what is the problem that we're defining? I think that problem A is that per capita GDP for the West Bank and Gaza, that they're very, very low compared to peer countries, especially for Gaza. And so Gaza is 159th in the world in per capita GDP, near Senegal and Myanmar. And West Bank, it's near Sri Lanka. But compared to peer countries, both of those numbers are very low. Now, economists are very much into studying, why are things high or low? What are the causes of that? And one of the things that we know is that if you have a country that has a sort of perhaps surprisingly low GDP, then very often it's because, as Mohammed discussed last night, it's because there's not a lot of capital. And so the next slide just shows you, what economists know, that there's a very strong relationship around the world between the amount of capital per capita in a country and their GDP per capita, because capital produces stuff. And so if you look at this line, which is basically focused on countries that have relatively low GDP per capita below $15,000, you can see that the capital per capita and the GDP per capita for Gaza are way, way down in the community of countries and sort of on par with Ethiopia, Central African Republic, and in the West Bank, where they're 121st out of 181 countries, then they're looking at about the amount of capital per capita of say India, which, if you consider also how rural much of India is sort of, again, a pretty surprising lack of capital. And then if you bring capital in to a country, then you don't necessarily know that it's going to be productive. And so the other thing that we think about when we're looking at the sources of low growth is human capital. And once again, and this is secondary school enrollment and GDP per capita across a bunch of countries. Once again, there's a clear relationship where you have more human capital, then you have higher GDP per capita. And the thing that really jumps out at us is that in the West Bank and Gaza, people are incredibly well educated, incredibly literate, and talented in the data, and that if they had the GDP that is commensurate for their level of education, which would be the point on the line, then their GDP would be about that per capita, the same as Brazil. And so these facts animated our conversations very, very early on, because we could see, if you take a country where you don't have an educated populace, that if you bring a bunch of capital in, then maybe it won't get productive right away. But the problem is not insurmountable. The problem is to take the red line in this chart and to just move it north and make it so if they could get just the predicted amount of GDP per capita given their level of literacy, then we could about triple their GDP. And so, that got us really, really excited about the potential of prosperity that we could deliver to the Palestinian people. And our view then is, well, we want to create rules that encourage governments to invest in things and encourage the private sector to invest in things. And at that moment, we started to study capital. And before we talk to two of the most important people who are going to help drive capital and drive the plan, I want to show you a short video that was made by a person who met with Jared and I a long time ago to talk about the relationship between capital and prosperity. Could we tee up the video, please?
This is a very important conference from my point of view. It touches on the issue of what do property rights do if you want to create prosperity and peace. There's more to it than meets the eye. When you think of property rights, generally you start thinking of a parcel of land, you start thinking of a building, and one doesn't look at the hinterland, at the metaphysics of it, which is that a property right not only means a piece of land, but it's documentation that piece after piece, document after document creates trust. Once it gets securitized and gets into the securities market and the capital markets, it becomes money. That's where money comes from. Only 3% of the money of the United States actually comes from the Fed. The rest is production by banks that receive guarantees, but these guarantees have got to be documented. So when you're talking about property rights and you're saying, my God, we require billions, you've actually got those billions in your land, in your assets, but you need to be able to document them so they produce money. That's what we've seen in Latin America. And the other side, of course, is that it also promotes peace.
So that brief interlude with Hernando de Soto is the moment Hernando connected us with the World Bank. Because people at the World Bank have been studying the lessons from his work in Peru and elsewhere about how you can radically transform economies when you improve their ability to document property rights. And so let's start the general conversation now with David Malpass, the president of the World Bank. And David, you're already very, very active in this place. Could you start by describing the things that you are doing and then maybe segue to talking about how you think that this plan that we've put forward would change what you're able to do?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the needs are urgent, and so in your statistics, that's showing you some of the challenges, the difficulties of the people in the West Bank and Gaza. The unemployment rate in areas is 50%, and so there, as you think about water, clean water, electricity, these are pressing, urgent needs. The bank's been involved in West Bank and Gaza since 1992, the end of 92, with the Oslo Accords. So over that, since 1993, the bank has itself put in $1.2 billion from its net income through trust funds that we operate in the West Bank and Gaza. There's one called the Palestinian Recovery Trust Fund, Recovery and Development Trust Fund. There is an infrastructure fund, and so they do projects. In addition to those kinds of activities, IFC, the International Finance Corporation, has done $330 million of investment in the private sector. We see the private sector of West Bank and Gaza as having potential and also being the proper way or the best way, the best hope forward for the people in those areas as they develop. MIGA, which is the part of the World Bank that can do risk guarantees, has done some $40 million of guarantees. And then in addition to those three different direct avenues for the World Bank, the bank manages multi-donor trust funds, which themselves have put in $1.3 billion through those mechanisms. So those draw on donors that want to be participating in the area. And of course, part of this process is to find full inclusion of the people, including Palestinian people, in a process that will end up with economic advance. So we're working hard as well in Jordan and in Egypt and in Lebanon because in the end, a regional process is going to be necessary. So the bank is fully engaged now through these trust funds that are aimed at helping the people of West Bank and Gaza, also through an institutional ability and memory that the bank has. Many of the people involved in the conference today have had roots in World Bank activities and in staff, and so that gives a platform for trying to find ways forward.
Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the parts of the plan that add things that you haven't been able to do yet, do any of them jump out at you as being like the first thing that we should focus on?
You know, we've looked at them and I've asked our people, so we have 3 people resident in Gaza City, 40 in Jerusalem. They are well acquainted with the various projects, and so I don't want to select from the mix, but there are pressing needs that are addressable, and that goes into, I mean, starting with electricity and water and wastewater treatment, but then we want to go immediately into the areas you mentioned of education and of skills being critical for the private sector. One other area or broad area I'll mention is governance, meaning how do you have accountability so that as you put in money, it's not wasted and it gets to the end purpose. And then I would say the ability to direct, or for the people themselves to help direct resources toward the logistics, the movement of people, both between the West Bank and Gaza. That's been an obstacle, but within the region as well, that becomes a critical path for economic advance.
Yeah, thanks. Now, Randall, one of the things I've noticed in your time there, it seems like about 10 years. Is that right?
It's been closer to 12.
12, okay.
Seems like
it's
15
a long time,
minutes underwater.
But it's just astonishing how you've transformed the company, and you have so much more content production than you did back then and so on. But one of the things that has really struck me is that you're spreading out around the world now. And that you're finding opportunities and then swooping in and building cellular networks and offering, competition against maybe previously state-owned monopolies and so on. And so could you start by maybe telling us, what are your success stories where you went into outside the U.S. and started to create, invest in infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure,
Sure.
And so that we could think about how that might look in this space?
Yeah, as I've been sitting here today listening to a lot of the discussion, we have a model that may be an interesting parallel to what we're talking about here, not as extreme, but Mexico was a market that I had always aspired to go into. We had to sell out of Mexico, and I love the market. I wanted to go back into the market, but it's a market that's just it was not conducive to coming in and investing. And the government under Peña Nieto, the last president, came in and they not only put in place what I will call pro-investment rules, they literally went in and changed the governing constitution of the country to protect the investment that people would put in, to give you some predictability of your investment. And so very strong measures were taken. We, AT&T, immediately jumped in. And we went into a country of 130 million people, roughly. And over the last 4 years, we have built a national network, 4th-generation network, in 4 years. Spent about $8 billion to build this network over 4 years, and we are now regarded as the best network in the country of Mexico. So it happened very quickly. It would not have happened without the changes in regulation and law and some confidence in terms of how contracts and concessions would be protected and enforced by law. But it's an example of how quickly now, with wireless technology, you can really turn these things up and you can move fast with them. And it's a good example.
And so just, and now I'm not going to hold you to these numbers, but if we look at Gaza and the West Bank and think about the geographic area that we're talking about, how much money do you think it would take to build a similar network? Guess.
Well,
I know you're not supposed to ask CEOs
I read
to
Jared's
guess
plan
numbers,
on the way
but-
here. I saw how much money had been set aside for communications and in digital. I'm a CEO. He way over budgeted. Okay.
Okay.
But
We're being risk averse to make
But
sure.
think about it. It's not a very large territory that we're talking about here, and $8 billion to build out the entire country of Mexico, which I'm guessing is probably somewhere between 5 to 8 times the square kilometers that what we're talking about here. The topography in Palestine is not a difficult topography to put in wireless technology. So it would be a fraction of what it cost us to do something in Mexico. So it's eminently affordable with, especially Steven Schwartzman said it yesterday. I thought he nailed it. When you look at the private capital required to put in infrastructure, communications, and so forth, the number is not a startling number for people like me that kind of broker in these things. It's a very manageable number, and it's something that could be done within the confines of what's been outlined.
Yeah, and
The details of the legal structure are important to this. They've passed a law on e-transactions, but are waiting to set up a certification authority that would actually make it run. So each of the steps of this is something that has to be decided and moved forward. So those create obstacles for the private sector development.
well, I'll toss this at you, David, but Randall, feel free to jump in too, which is that I know that you folks have studied what happens when all of a sudden you put in a modern telecommunications network into a country that didn't previously have one. Could you describe some of the positive effects that you've seen in countries when that happened?
So there's a range. One part is mobile banking. So as people, one of the hardest things for people to do is to be able to have money that keeps value and then transact, because either the bills, the currency is too small or too large or gets lost or gets stolen. And so there's been big advances in mobile banking through cell phones. So that immediately begins to have a payoff. But another area is just the exchange of information that comes out of the ability to have contact with your distant relative in the rural area. What are you planting this year, or what the ability to transfer information. One of the obstacles, though, that we are still confronting is electricity. Odd as it sounds, there are still some estimates put it at 70% of the people in Africa not electrified. I was in Ethiopia recently. They're making strides by allowing private sector contractors to do the last mile, the actual hookup to the grid. I was in Madagascar, and they have the problem of just a small percentage of the population actually has electricity still, even though they may have enough agricultural output to have calorie intake, and yet no connectivity to the rest of the world. So building out those opportunities. Solar power creates some chance that, the prices come down a lot. So there are parts of the world, and especially in this region, where solar is cost effective, and so that's a way to go around the grid. But the best way is to have functioning electric grids, which is a big challenge in West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah.
I would. We all have lofty perceptions of the area where we work day in and day out. Communications, I put right behind electricity and potable water and such as a necessity for today's society. And as I've listened to everything you've talked about over the course of today, whether it is democratization of education and educational opportunities, whether it is banking services, whether healthcare, all the things that we're talking about, in this society, those are, I fundamentally believe, not achievable on a broad-based basis without a robust communications infrastructure. And all the things you're talking about require technology and digitalization to make that happen. And so it has stimulative effects on economic growth, and those are discernible and they're measurable. But I would go so far as to say the things that you have spoken of and that are on this wall around here, you can't get to without a robust communication infrastructure. And the beauty of where we are today is the communication technology is such, you can now accommodate that with wireless technology. You don't have to go wiring up remote locations. I mean, literally, we're at a place today where you can get there with wireless technology.
And we're also at a place, which is remarkable, that the guy that owns the last mile to every house in America is celebrating. Well, not every house, but you used to be the last mile company, right?
Right.
And yet here you are flourishing with it. And that, what that means is that this problem can be solved really, really rapidly. When I've looked at the literature and a lot of World Bank studies, the things that jump out at me are that when you have access to the internet in, say, a zip code or in a local area, then all of a sudden out-migration stops and business formation goes up and the unemployment rate drops. And so I wonder, you've probably seen that in the places in Mexico as you've diffused out, you've driven down prices, and you've increased access to the internet. And so have you seen that in Mexico?
Absolutely. You see new businesses stood up in remote areas, tendras we call them in Mexico. You begin to see those pop up. You see distribution in all new areas of the economy. And what's really important is as you go in and you build this infrastructure, in the 4 years since we've been in Mexico, the cost of communications has dropped by 40%. 40% in 4 years. So there's this virtuous cycle that occurs here. Costs drop. As costs drop, what happens? Adoption picks up. As adoption picks up, what happens? You have the stimulative effect of greater job creation and greater GDP growth. And so it's a beautiful situation that happens as you push these technologies deeper and deeper into these societies.
The World Bank does a doing business report that tries to keep track of regulatory changes that can help. And we haven't talked about it, but it's very empowering for people. Women have often been left out of the labor force or the ability to hold money. And so the World Bank does another report in addition to the doing business report, one called Women, Business, and the Law, that keeps track of the countries allowing women to hold property or to hold money. That becomes an important starting point, because in a lot of places around the world, the women are doing some of the earning and often much of the earning of the money, and yet haven't had an ability to hold it. So as you get into e-banking or mobile banking, that empowers, and that then becomes that's quite additive to GDP. If you think of GDP as the sum of the production of all the people within an economy, if you add in half the population, you get big gains. And I think those are readily available. What the World Bank has been able to do in some countries, for example, Pakistan, is have cards or have some kind of technology, often paired with either banks or with telecommunications companies, where money can be stored, and that way available to women, available for girls that are getting education out of the schools. So all of these are highly empowering for societies.
So we teed up the session with this wonderful quick interview with Hernando de Soto, and the West executive sounded like a helicopter was taking off if you heard the low. But I know the World Bank has embraced some of his thoughts about how important property rights are. And you have a big project in Africa to try to make it easier for people to understand who has title to what and so on. And so could you report a little bit about how you're doing that and how it's been working in other countries that you've been shooting for? And then Randall, after that, I'd be interested in, so you just had this big success in Mexico. I presume you're looking for other such successes. So give us an idea of like what you want to see so that you're willing to go toss your billions of dollars in there to build a network. But let's start with David.
Well, there's a range of activities and laws. So a starting point is just a law that allows people to hold property and to transfer it on death. So basics of a rule of law kind of environment. But then in some countries, so I was in Mozambique recently, they don't have a registration process that keeps track of who owns property. So people end up having to physically stay on their property in order to assert property rights. So the bank then can come in and try to have a registration process that allows people to identify the property that is their property, and that's the beginning of a licensing, a title process. But if you think about it, it's harder than it seems because there hasn't historically been a deed. There's not a piece of paper that says, and in some countries, women and girls are not identified as people from the documentation standpoint, meaning the need to have actual evidence of their numbers, some proof of that. So getting all of those steps together in a way that then allows transfer of title turns out to be a process that takes time and takes quite a bit of involvement. And the bank helps countries do that. Even in Egypt, or in Egypt, for example, which is there is a challenge in transferring title, and that means you can't, in many cases, borrow against that title. So that ends up being a paralysis of the financing mechanisms within the country as well. So those are things that the World Bank is quite involved in, is creating the computer registry. Now with satellite imagery, there's an ability to speed up that process because you can literally look at the plot, and then people can claim, they claim their plot, they register it, and that's the first step in getting an actual title.
And I'm just going to, because I'm more enthusiastic about everything, right, than you sometimes, and I'm just going to say what you guys are doing is amazing, and that because of blockchain technologies, that it turns out that property rights can be codified in a way that kicks an economy into a high gear way faster than it used to be. When Hernando de Soto did it in Peru, he had to go to every courthouse in the country, but now you guys can do it with satellites and everything else. And so again, what it means is that part of our plan, I guess I'm excited about a lot of our plan, but that part of the plan is one of the things I'm most excited about, because then we've created a place where the private capital Mohammed mentioned last night can go in.
Sorry to interrupt. So I was in Madagascar. I was asked to convey some of the registrations to, these are rice farmers who've never known whether they had 1 hectare or 1.2 hectares. And so by having the registration, they can then aspire, they can show it within the financial system to say, I can get more out of that. So they're both proud of ownership. It gives them more feeling of ownership, and then that adds to the productivity. And then if you add into that better seeds, which is an important part of productivity, then their output goes up. They have a more valuable piece of property. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
It's an important piece. As we think about going in and investing, I've heard a lot of it said over the course of today. I don't need to reiterate it, but in our industry, and as well as many others in infrastructure, they are capital intensive. And so you're looking for structures that are conducive for investing capital. And for a company like ours, I told you Mexico, we invested $8 billion over 4 years. We're not just going in and writing checks, and we're not just buying equipment. For us, that means 60 to 70% of that $8 billion is people. These are people putting fiber in the ground to cell sites, building cell sites, putting antennas on cell sites, doing customer care. It's people. And so do you have an environment conducive to investment and an environment conducive to hiring a lot of people? In Mexico, it was tens of thousands of new jobs that we went in and hired. And so investment, the things you heard about, and you were actually just talking about it, is, respect for contracts. Is there laws surrounding respect for contracts, and are there courts to adjudicate independently contractual disputes? That is priority number one. And if you don't have that, you don't go into a market to compete. And the second is, what is the fiscal or the tax situation around it? And when you invest as much capital as we do, these are 10 and 15-year projects, you get to year 5 before you start generating cash flows on these things. What's the taxation around those? And how predictable and stable is the tax environment? And if something is very volatile, you can't predict, what the returns are going to be 5 to 10 years out. That's a big deterrent for us. The third, this one's really critical for us, is the regulatory regime around it. And not just, regulation like we think of FCC in the US, but if you're going to go invest capital, you're going to allocate capital to go put plant in the ground, what are the zoning and the permitting processes like in these particular areas? Is every town a different zoning and permitting process? Is there graft and corruption involved in getting permits and getting rights of ways? If you have a lot of that to fight with, you're probably not going to go and invest. And even if you do, it's going to be slow investment and unpredictable investment. And then I get back to the workforce. I loved your graphic in terms of secondary education penetration versus GDP. That is everything for us. You better have an educated workforce that you can put to work in short order without having to do extensive 12-month training cycles with people. And so the employment, the educated workforce is a major driver for people like us. And then one I would tell you that may be specific to communications, but it's an important one for people to consider. You're starting to see some new approaches to driving investment in communications, and that is, if you want to go into the wireless business in a country, the commodity you must possess is airwaves, licenses to airwaves. We call it spectrum. And you're starting to see models evolve, and these are fascinating to me, where governments are beginning to realize that's a currency. That's a currency that can be used to build out this infrastructure. And so you want access to these airways, give long-term access in exchange for you put the capital in and build it out. Too often countries come along and they see this as the piggy bank. And they sell off the spectrum for companies to come in and build, and then they take the money and use for general purposes, and they don't ever get the infrastructure for it. This idea of using this spectrum as a currency to stimulate the investment and to build out these networks, we're seeing happen more and more. In fact, we're even seeing it in the US. This administration has put a model in place that is really a model for developing countries around the world to use, how you pay for this development.
So we're almost out of time, and
I have a thought.
You have a thought? But let me ask you a question, and then you can work your thought into it, like as if we were on TV and you wanted to avoid my question, right? I think that it feels like people, because we're not politicians, we're not diplomats, but the economists and the businessmen, people haven't said, well, let's assume that somehow it gets worked out. What does the West Bank and Gaza, what does it look like? And when we do that, then it's just like an incredibly promising story. So what do you think we've accomplished by describing that story here in this conference?
Perfect segue. So the potential is really big of people. So they're empowered with some rule of law, with some ability to have mobility. We're in Bahrain today. They've created a flexible work permit because they need more work. They've brought women into the workforce. They have women judges, addition of people, and then bringing people in from outside with flexible work permits that allows them to move from job to job. These are all showing the value of people that have education, that have mobility within their physical region, and so that shows the big earning power of people. So as we apply that to West Bank and Gaza, if there was a program that included the Palestinians and that recognized the value of that, I think the upside is just very big.
Randall, would you like a final word in there?
Look, guys and gals like me look for opportunities where infrastructure and digital technology is under-penetrated and underdeveloped with educated workforces. I got to tell you, you put rule of law and predictability, some degree of predictability around some of the numbers that you put up here, it's just ripe. we look for opportunities like that, right? And I don't think you would have any issue of attracting capital and bringing world-class modern infrastructure and digital technology into an environment like that if you surrounded it with the right governance and rule of law.
Well, thank you, Randall. Thank you, David. And thank you, audience, for joining us in this session.